What's up, guys? Ivan Carranza here, and welcome to Bass Tone Tuesday. This is part 4 of the analog versus digital series. And on the last video, I asked you to let me know which or what would be your ideal rig setup for live situations. I'm gonna read some of the comments that I've gotten, and then I'm gonna share with you the reason behind my choice of buying with my own money. I paid full price the Neural DSP Quad Cortex, and what is my thought process behind the whole thing. The first one is from Joe, and it's a pretty long comment. For live, I'm pretty happy with the convenience of all digital effects into either an amp or decent stage monitoring. What I'm more bothered by is awful front-of-house engineers. That is another topic for a whole another video, but I'm gonna keep reading. Actually, my ideal would be a robust way of getting the full bias effects experience onto a stage environment. I love the tones from that. I've never used bias effects personally, but I've heard that some people have used it and they're pretty happy with the result from that. For home and studio use, my ideal rig is all discrete pedals and real amp. Ideally, I also DI with a choice of top preamps depending on my needs. My biggest struggle is matching my at-home practice rig through headphones or desk monitors to my live studio rig. I'd be happy with almost any combination of gear which facilitated this. Now, about the last point about matching your home sound to the live sound, I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with because they are two very different situations. You know, you're at home in a very controlled environment and you play mostly by yourself, right? Maybe you're doing covers or playing to a track, but you're playing on your own, right? So the most important thing is that you sound good. Once you insert the variables of other instruments, a different space, a big room, an open air, venue, things are gonna change, and the way you perceive your bass on stage is gonna be different than the way people in front, the audience perceive the sound of your bass. So trying to mimic the way you have your amp at home is kind of tricky, because what sounds good at home, like a really cool bass sound at home, might sound like complete trash in a live mix. So you have to really know how a bass tone fits in a mix so that you dial in your at-home sound that way so that it can translate later for the final mix, either live or for a studio track. I see a lot of people, and I've done a video about this, about the mids. A bass sounds really cool when you boost a lot of treble and boost a lot of bass and you scoop the mids. It sounds like super full, and you have a lot of clarity and you remove a lot of air. But depending on the type of music, you're probably gonna get lost in a mix that way. On your own, it sounds amazing, but once other instruments come in, you're stepping into the territory of other instruments, or other instruments are masking your frequencies. So you have to be careful with that. Now, it depends what kind of mid frequencies you're cutting and whatnot, but trying to take the exact same sound, 1-to-1 from the bedroom to the stage is something that I wouldn't strive for. I would try to make a bass sound, or to dial in a bass sound that fits into, the context that you want to make it work in. So if it's a blues type of tone, try to make the bass fit for that. If it's a reggae or a rock and roll or metal, listen to the whole, sound spectrum. Listen to all the other instruments. Where does your bass fit into each one of them? Adjust at home and then take that to the gig. And even though you mentioned that about the sound engineers, I would probably, listen to what they're saying and adjust the way they suggest you to, because at the end of the day, they have all the power over the way your band sounds like. So if they tell you, hey, could you please turn down the bass a little bit? If you're too stubborn to do it and you're like, but that's my sound, probably you're not gonna sound good anyway, because he's gonna have to fight your EQ and EQ on top of that. So you have to make a compromise and, try to look eye to eye with the people in front of house. And I know this because some of my friends do live sound, and I know and I've heard all the stories they have told me about, working for other people. The next comment is by Lee Henderson, and he says, okay, this is a topic I can dig into. My normal signal chain is mostly analog. Current amp, cab, pedal setup, bass, MTD, great brand, head Aguilar Tonehammer 500, cab Aguilar SL112 twice, and pedal Zoom B6. Lee, that is a fantastic analog signal chain. I mean, with that setup, you can probably play any gig you want. You're gonna cover a lot of territory, and it's most likely gonna be loud enough. He continues to say, I'm going to try and not use this as an ad for the Zoom pedal, but I think it's the best I ever heard. I consider this a hybrid setup. Most of my gigs are done with the AG head and cabs. Once in a while, I need some different tones, which I get from my Zoom. Over the years, I have tried almost every bass pedal out there. That includes analog pedals as well as digital pedals. My problem with digital pedals is that they all mostly sound like digital effects. Some are guitar pedals tweaked and rebadged as bass pedals, and they sound like it. The new Zoom B6 sounds like it was made for bass. Its sound is tuned right. As the product matures, user interface needs work, it will be a gold standard for bass pedals. I have never tried the B6 by Zoom, but to me it sounds like you found your ideal setup and you complement the core setup that you have, which is the bass, amp, and cabinets, by adding the Zoom B6 when you need some other sounds. And to be fair, as a working bass player, you can get, you can play pretty much any music style with a good and solid, clean sound, maybe add a little bit of dirt. Doesn't even have to be like massive amounts of distortion, just a little bit of breakup and compression, and maybe some chorus and an octave pedal. You can get a lot of you can cover a lot of territory with those few effects. And if you can add some more using the Zoom B6, then by all means, keep doing that. The next comment is from Will Obst, and he says, right, it's easier to get a decent tone from an amp, as long as not a tube amp. I owned an Ampeg B4B years ago, and it was kind of a diva. Sound depended on clean power supply, temperature, and maybe even humidity. Glad that I sold this. I never could be sure to have a good sound on a gig. I'd like to add one aspect. Some amps only sound great when a certain loudness is reached, mostly guitar amps, but I feel some bass amps are the same. Often, this is impossible on a small gig, so maybe a digital solution is a better idea, depending on the situation. I fully agree with that, with the second comment. For the first one, I have never had any issues playing through a tube amp, but I haven't owned one. I've played a couple ones at studios or on festivals where I've played, and I had a backline, of an Ampeg, and I always had a good sound, but I never owned one, so I can't really comment on that. Now, for point number 2 about reaching certain volumes before sounding good, I agree with that partially because some amps do sound better, especially tube amps or amps that, kind of like emulate tube breakup or, harmonics, because when you bump up some more gain, the way the gain structure interacts with the EQ section is going to change, and you're going to get a different sound, which might be more pleasing for you, or it's going to achieve the result that you want. On the other hand, however, we perceive volumes of different frequencies differently depending on how loud they are. At quieter volumes, we perceive mids being more prominent than the lows and highs. And at louder volumes, we perceive lows and treble to be being louder than the mids, while mids kind of sound softer. So that is kind of tricky because you're kind of battling on, two fronts. And that is one reason why it's important to always compare your sound quietly and also loud in a loud scenario. And if you only dial in sounds in your bedroom or at home at very quiet volumes, you might be over-EQing because you're not hearing enough bass or enough treble. And then you go to a gig and it's just a mud fest because you boosted too much bass and it's like, all the time. And if you're too loud, you might kind of like pull back on the mids too much. You might need to bump them a little bit. So that's why it's good to compare in both settings, quietly and also in a loud setting. So I would suggest having a core sound for your band, for example, that okay, this is the way my bass fits within the music of my band. Remember that you're gonna need to adjust depending on the venue. Venue A might be more boomy than venue B, so you might need to pull back on the bass a little bit. Or maybe the engineer is gonna tell you, leave it at like the same, I'm going to do all the changes. But I think open communication between the engineer is always good for these reasons. And don't be too stubborn and say, this is my sound. I'm just going to keep it the way it is because I dialed in and I need it to be the same. Be open to change because that's going to help you sound better at the end of the day, most likely. The next comment is from Rupert, and he says, "Oh man, there is so much to be said about this topic. I pretty much agree with all you said in your video. I also feel like it's easier to get something good out of the digital world for the guitar. Indeed, I'm sometimes missing the rumble from my bass amp in our rehearsal room. Last point regarding knowing your gear, I've learned that if you don't know the purpose of a knob, don't touch it and leave it at the 12 o'clock position, especially when you dive into the modeling realm. I'm looking at you, Helix, with your hum, sag, bias X settings. Definitely not feeling the rumble and when playing is probably one of the biggest downsides with going purely digital or with only a DI signal, because you can also play completely ampless with just DI box. It doesn't have to be digital. Because you're missing that physical feedback when you're playing. You don't have that feeling of the weight and the impact that your notes are having. But there are kind of like solutions for that. There's, I think it's called the beatback, or the backbeat, which is put on your strap and you feel it rumbling. There's also a sub pack, which is kind of like a vest. IAMPS has a floorboard. There are ways to solve this issue. You can also have side fills on the stage, so not necessarily a bass amp, but something to fill up the stage that also works. And regarding the not knowing your gear part or knowing your gear, I think it's important to definitely know how things work. And when you get a new piece of gear and you're like super happy and it's the honeymoon phase and you're like, yes, awesome, you start turning things, and you might want to take that, for example, if you have a gig coming up and you just got the pedal the same day, you might want to take it there and then you're at the gig and you're like, oh, why doesn't it sound good? Sometimes you're playing, you're about to record, and they tell you, hey, can you turn down this and that? And if you don't know how to do that quickly, you're gonna spend time, how does this work? Why doesn't it sound the way I want it to sound? If you know how to make quick changes, everyone is gonna be happy about that because it's gonna lead you to better results and faster than just guessing. And the last comment is by PoW Karen, and this one is very interesting. He says, too much digital and computer orientation into music can steer it towards being clinical and to a degree eventually sterile. Music should be people-oriented and have more feel and emotion, and this can be achieved better with an amp over a digital format. Now, because I found that comment somewhat interesting and thought-provoking, I shared it on Instagram, and these are the results that I got with the question, thoughts? Roughly translated, this means if an analog musician plays like crap is gonna come out of an analog gear anyway. It's pretty much self-explanatory bollocks. Digital has opened up every toolbox for free, and if you're making bad music, it's your fault. Then this person clearly doesn't record herself too much at home. People make music and emotion, not the instrument. This one translates roughly to, he's full of crap. Art is subjective. If you've got a bias against digital, that is not the way. And finally, we have, it's just a tool. Like any tool, it can be used as a crutch, but that comes down to the user. Now, I definitely agree with a lot of those comments. And I don't see using digital equipment, gear, pedals, plugins, etc., what you name it, as taking emotion out of music. If that was the case, pretty much 99% of the music that's being released nowadays would be emotionless or would, be not human. And some of it is, of course, if everything is time aligned and you want it to sound fairly clinical, digital, electronic, if you want to put it that way, you can make it sound like that. But pretty much everything is being recorded into digital interfaces and being processed and recorded into digital audio working stations, so DAWs, in a laptop or a computer, unless you have a big budget and you want to mix and record at a console, which I imagine most people don't. So I have never, avoided listening to something because I thought, oh, you know what, that sounds a bit too digital. And for example, having the option of using digital plugins when recorded is actually a very good way of being creative with EQing and sending tones to people. If I record a track, a DI track, and somebody sends me a song, and then I put a plugin in there, like an amp sim, send the track, and the person says to me, could you maybe add some more minutes? I can just go to my plugin, add some more minutes, and send it back without having to re-record the entire performance and mic up everything and, the whole process. Of course, you have to take into consideration that having unlimited options can be a crutch, like that person in the comments said, because if you are always permitted to change things, you might end up changing things constantly. So committing to a sound is always a good thing. If you're dialing one tone and you're like sure that that's a fairly good sound, go with that and only change it if it's really necessary. But constantly changing things is can be like chasing your own tail at some point. So you gotta pay attention to that. The reason why I decided to buy the Quad Cortex, even though I was pretty happy with the way my sound was and my setup, and I was pretty happy with my pedal board because it covered pretty much everything that I wanted to play for the bands that I play with. And I was like, why would I want a digital board or a digital piece of gear if I already have a pretty solid analog signal chain? And then I got my universal audio interface, which is right here, and I started using the amp sims there. And I would plug my bass into my Noble and then go into my interface, and nobody, seriously, nobody has ever told me, that sounds a bit too digital. That doesn't sound good. And I was always pretty happy with the result of the amps or the amp sounds that I'm getting out of that. And they're all plugins. They're all digital recreations of real gear. But not once did I question the quality by thinking, that's a bit too digital. I'm not going to use that. Which led me to, if I'm using already digital stuff to record, why not try and get one thing that can do a bunch of different sounds and treat it the same way that I was doing it before? Because it's, like I mentioned, it's easier to overuse the effects that you have here, but by using simple signal paths that I would use anyway, but having the convenience of being able to take all those sounds, different amps, different pedals, in just this format, and fairly light at that, I don't see a reason why not, unless it doesn't sound good. And to me, so far, it's sounding great. And like I said, I paid full price for this unit. Neural DSP is not paying me anything to say about the unit. And I was very skeptical at first because of all the hype that's been there out on the internet about this. But so far, I'm digging it. And you're probably going to hear and see more of this in the channel because I'm experimenting with a couple of things here and there. and getting great results so far. And like with most things in life, you probably shouldn't see things, black and white. There are gray areas. So it's very situational dependent, what your band plays, what kind of tone you want to have, what kind of setting you're in, what type of sounds are needed from you, and also, can you carry everything that you need to a gig? Is it convenient? Is it payable? Those are all variables that you have to take into account to see whether using something like this is worth it to you or not. I hope you guys liked the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. And also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with the content that's coming to the channel. As always, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care.